Chapter 171. Dungeon Breakthrough 2. We're going to take over the dungeon now. Please wait a moment. It sounded a bit far away, like a cell phone call with a poor signal, but it was definitely Lucius' voice. One day passed after Yong-ho's army defeated the main forces of the Eastern Army. Yong-ho, who kept making an inroad into the eastern area without a hitch, took over the dungeon of the Nagaraja master who had surrendered and used it as a forward base. The number of the Eastern Masters also dropped significantly amid the turbulence caused by embryo. According to the Nagaraja Master, there were only 2 Eastern Masters under the command of Stravadi and Sargatanas, and the number of soldiers that the Eastern Army could mobilize again was about 1,000 or so. Given that even if all the soldiers left in the north or scattered in various dungeons were mobilized, it would be no more than 200, and so Yong-ho didn't have to worry about confronting the enemy with a huge army beyond his imagination. The intelligence that the Nagaraja Master provided was better than expected. He even knew the power of Stravadi and Sargatanas. Stravadi's power was short-range space jump, while Sargatanas' power was strengthening of the body. Both were good at close combat, but Stravadi of the Nagaraja race also seemed to be good at spelling magic. In some respects, they might be tougher than Yong-ho thought. Yong-ho sat down on the throne engraved with a serpent's head and pondered over how to deal with the two. He drew a map of the eastern area in his mind. The current dungeon was located in the south within the eastern area. Moving a little further to the northeast, he could find Stravadi's dungeon. Tigrius, Rickham, and Ophelia said in unison that the next battle would be a dungeon battle, not a battle in the open field like this. Their opinion was reasonable. Actually, Yong-ho himself thought of fighting the King of Gluttony at the dungeon fight instead of a battle. It was when the master was fighting at the dungeon that he became the strongest. Thanks to the dungeon market, the concept of supplies in the demon world was different from what they used in the human world. As long as they could secure a dungeon with access to the virtual space of the dungeon market and enough funds, they could deliver supplies even into the heart of the enemy camp, though incompletely. Yong-ho had no intention of letting Stravadi buy his time. He intended to devour the eastern area quickly, like lightning. The current situation was different from when he defeated Agares. Back then, he was pressed for time. He had to hurriedly take the essence of the dungeon's heart and leave the eastern area while guarding against other masters in the surrounding areas. But it was different this time. The dungeon's treasures and resources, dungeon spirits, and the essence of the heart. He intended to take away all of them by all means. Really, he would do it. Just like the King of Greed. Takeover of the dungeon was over. Are you going to access the virtual space of the dungeon market? The energy of greed arose. The greed that grew much bigger and more abundantly than before engulfed Catalina and Kaiwan, standing next to the throne. It did not stop there and spread widely. Yong-ho closed his eyes and accessed the virtual space of the dungeon market recognition number 009, descendants of the man. The Yong-ho Cheon, the current master of the House of Mammon, WSU recognition has been completed. Welcome. As soon as he arrived in the all-white virtual space, the letters of light spread in front of his eyes amid a woman's hard voice. Since he already experienced it, he waited instead of feeling embarrassed. As he expected, her voice continued. Citri is currently taking care of her personal affairs. You can't chat with Citri at this time. Would you like to go back, or would you like to trade in normal mode? Yong-ho agonized for a moment. Last time, he waited for Citri while trading in normal mode, but he didn't have to do it again this time. It was true that his conversation with Citri was pleasant, but he was not here to play in the virtual space. He came here to purchase supplies and various equipment for attacking the dungeon. It's regrettable, but I can't help it anyway. It seemed that the war between kings in the northern area seemed to affect the dungeon market more than he expected. Let me trade in normal mode this time. I want to buy supplies and equipment for attacking a dungeon. Okay, we will provide you with the relevant catalogs. A white chair soared behind his back. He, seated in place, reached for it in the air. Then, he came to grab 2 catalogs. What I need most, above all, is food and lighting devices for the dungeon. By the way, is it a woman? Feeling something all of a sudden, he looked a little further away. Since both the sky and the earth were pure white, a new being appeared in an all-white world where even he could not identify the horizon. Her bright blonde and black wings made a strong contrast. Her neat and active suit reminded him of a career woman in the human world. Although she was at quite a distance, she was an outstanding beauty that Yong-ho could recognize at a glance, as if she was stepping down from the air. She came down but flinched momentarily. She seemed to be surprised to see him. No, she's a little different. There was no clear evidence that he could think so, but he felt that way. She seemed to have been surprised by the fact that there was someone in this space. He called a table from the floor and put the catalogs on it. Rather than rushing to act, he wanted to watch how the woman would act first. The woman didn't agonize for long. She flapped her big wings once, and in no time, she narrowed her distance with him. When he looked at her up close, she was so kind and gentle despite her black wings that he immediately thought she was an angel. However, it was just her look only, her eyes that were as soft as a gentle sheep showed she was smart. Landing in front of him, she politely bowed to him as Chitri did. She introduced herself with a gentle smile. I am Samael, one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market in Yong-ho. Yong-ho got up from his seat and returned her greeting, and there was a moment of silence. Both of them quickly examined each other as if they promised to do so. It was Samael who opened her mouth first. You must be the master of the House of Mammon. I have heard of your excellent military activities in the south. It is an honor for me to meet you like this. She once again appreciated him politely. It seemed that during that short span of her greeting him with a nod, she obtained some information about him at the dungeon market. Yong-ho also succeeded in recalling her name, Dungeon Merchant Auction House. She was its manager there. Yong-ho once participated in the auction with Chitri. Why did she come here? Why was she showing interest in him? In the human world, Samael could be called an executive of a world-class multinational company and a top-ranking executive overseeing business in Europe at that. But Samael was now looking at Yong-ho with curiosity, who was the master of the House of Mammon in the abandoned southern land. Of course, his situation in the southern land was not the same as before. He built up power enough to be comparable with that of the very powerful demon kings of the demon world. So, even if she was one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market, it would be hard for her to look down on him. However, there was a difference between her looking down on him and her looking at him with lots of interest and curiosity. Why? For what purpose? I came here to see Chitri, but I unexpectedly met a nobleman here. Are you usually doing business with Chitri like this? As if to read his mind, Samael quenched his curiosity readily. She was now showing interest in Yong-ho because of Chitri. Yong-ho pondered over her question, namely her question about him doing business with Chitri as usual and the way she behaved when she appeared in this space first. And he could discover why she was surprised when she knew he was in this space. It was never uncommon for Chitri to deal directly with her client. So, Samael wanted to know the reason why Chitri wanted to face Yong-ho in person. Samael, somebody, not Yong-ho, called her. Samael turned back to the voice naturally. Chitri. Wearing a nightgown, Chitri let out a long breath. She concealed her fatigue and said to Yong-ho, Dear client, could you wait a minute? Please. Samael looked back at Yong-ho. Instead of answering, Yong-ho responded with a nod. Then Chitri and Samael disappeared, and within a few seconds, Chitri appeared again. What about Samael? When Yong-ho asked instinctively, Chitri frowned a bit. Then she curled her lips and approached him. I sent her back for now. Did she act rudely? No, not at all. When he replied, Chitri sighed again. She seemed uncomfortable just like she did when she was caught recalling the memories about the House of Mammon the other day. But shortly afterward, she made a smile again and gently pressed her chest. In the blink of an eye, she took off the nightgown and put on the dress she usually wore. Do you know that your pupils got big a moment ago? Instead of answering, he cleared his throat at her mischievous question. Chitri made a hearty laugh as usual. Now, what kind of deal do you want today? Let me provide a little more service than usual, because I feel sorry for being late. She winked at him right at the moment when she mentioned a little more, then sat down on the chair that soared before her and leaned against it. Yong-ho also sat down. He started striking up a deal with her as she wanted. Chapter 172, Dungeon Breakthrough for Yong-ho's transaction in the virtual space was over. His connection with it was also lost. Instead of opening his eyes right away, he thought of something that he put off as an afterthought. Samael used honorifics when speaking to Chitri, and Chitri sent back none other than Samael in a few seconds. one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market? Is Citri also one of the 5 directors? If so, Citri's usual joke about describing herself as a big guy at the dungeon market was true. Well, it was natural if he came to think about it. Citri was Mammon's lover, the king of greed. This meant that she was one of the giant dungeon spirits that lived for over 1,000 years. There was nothing wrong with her, even if she was called one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market. So, Yongho didn't bother much because his ties with her wouldn't change anyway, even if Citri was one of the 5 directors or not 5 directors. At least, Samael doesn't know Citri's relationship with Mammon. And Citri wants to hide it. Although there were some assumptions in his thinking like that, his conclusion was quite reasonable. He thought about one more thing. A master's frequent meeting with Citri. How would it affect his deal if it was known that a master meets Citri often? Am I too worried? Maybe it was meaningless. If something urgent really had happened, Citri would have sent him back, not Samael, but it was clear that he was bothered by Citri's action. He even felt that he was attracting Citri's unnecessary attention. Whatever Yongho opened his eyes, he gently shook his head to put it out of his mind. The immediate task for him was to occupy the eastern area. Are you back? Did you buy a lot of cheap stuff? What about my gift? Catalina and Kaiwan asked, as if they were waiting for him. Instead of replying, Yongho looked for Eligos and Ophelia to discuss some practical matters. 2 days later, Yongho started to attack Stravadi's dungeon. There were 2 ways to attack the dungeon. One of them was to just blindly dispatch a huge number of troops to neutralize the traps inside the dungeon and take over it. The other was to properly attack the dungeon by infiltrating the elite force. Most of the masters preferred the first option compared to the second if they could afford it, even if their damage was heavy. Attacking a dungeon was completely unpredictable to any attacker. On the other hand, a dungeon was the ultimate home ground for the defenders. It was dangerous to send an elite force to such a place. What if the elite dungeon spirits fall into an unexpected trap and get killed? They were different from low-quality spirits that could be easily obtained with money. There was a high possibility that the elite spirits could not be obtained even with money. Moreover, if the killed spirits were put to service as dungeon spirits, they would deal a considerable blow to the dungeon master. For this reason, the attack on the dungeons in the demon world was often carried out in the following ways. They send a large-scale force of low quality to neutralize the defenders' traps and collect information on the inside of the dungeon. After that, an elite force could pass through the incapacitated trap zone, destroy the defender's force, and occupy the dungeon. Generally speaking, when attackers devised tactics, the defenders also prepared their own tactics. But the attackers changed their tactics too often, so the defenders changed the dungeons accordingly. As for the traps, those with a wide range of effectiveness and specialization in slaughter were preferred to those with high power and accuracy. And the structure of the dungeon was changed in a way that was easier to deal with a large number of attackers rather than a small one, so they could trap them all at once. But there was one thing that didn't change. What was the most annoying and difficult thing when attacking a dungeon? Yongho, who had not much experience in attacking dungeons, could easily answer that question. It was because anybody could easily answer it if they thought about the PC games they used to enjoy during their middle and high school days. The answer to this question was getting lost in the dungeon. In other words, the attackers keep wandering about in the same place because they couldn't find the right way. Demon King Orpaso, who was famous for making dungeons in the past, said, "The best and worst dungeon is the labyrinth." Stravadi, always reliant on rational thinking, turned his dungeon into a labyrinth. His dungeon was huge above all. It was large enough to hold 3 to 4 dungeons, compared with a typical dungeon in the southern area. Moreover, the passages inside were complicated. They were not just a motley of crossroads. Stravadi could change its internal structure in real time. Of course, due to more variability and more complicated passages, the durability of the dungeon wall could be problematic for the dungeon owner. But Stravadi solved this problem in a very simple way. He expanded the dungeon site. If the dungeon site was wide enough to create a complex passage with walls of sufficient thickness and strength, he would not have to worry about it. It was only Stravadi, the designer of the dungeon, who perfectly understood the dungeon structure. The dungeon spirits knew no more than the zone assigned to them. Stravadi, located in the Demon King's room in the deepest part of the dungeon, believed in his dungeon, a labyrinth that he built with utmost efforts. So, as always, he devised a rational and simple strategy. The House of Mammon was now the only enemy to Stravadi. If he defeated its master, he would achieve everything. That was why he spared no time and effort to win in this battle. His strategy was to reduce the combat power of the House of Mammon and wear them out. He was ready to use all his available dungeon spirits and traps for that purpose. A true labyrinth didn't allow for the attacker's entry, but also their exit. So, once the attackers were lured into entering the dungeon, half the battle was already over. Stravadi intended to lure the master of the House of Mammon and his dungeon spirits into his dungeon and kill them slowly. That was his plan, which he had to carry out, and by all means at that. But how could they break through it? Stravadi asked in a low voice. Instead of expressing anger, he gave it a serious thought. He tried to understand the unreasonable situation unfolding before his eyes right now. Stravadi's dungeon spirits, who were called the Four Knights of the East, also could not hide their embarrassment. What was happening in the dungeon map, that the souls of the dungeon opened in the air, were completely beyond Stravadi's expectations. The infiltration troops of the House of Mammon were advancing straight ahead inside the dungeon. Straight, without any hesitation or wandering, they were advancing through the shortest route, straight. Even the structural change of the dungeon itself, Stravadi's pride, was not functioning. When he changed the route by manipulating the forks and part of the passage, the infiltrating force of the Mammon family changed the route accordingly. The Four Knights did not fully understand the structure of the dungeon. However, they partly knew that there were limits to structural changes. Moreover, the Mammon family's infiltrating forces found and destroyed the core structures that were subject to change. By doing so, they gradually reduced the room for Stravadi's changing the dungeon itself. Stravadi's dungeon was no longer a labyrinth. It was just a simple one-way dungeon. Moreover, that wasn't the only problem. Yong-ho did not dispatch a large unit into the dungeon. He sent a relatively small number of only 40 members there. Besides, it wasn't just ordinary dungeon spirits that attacked at the forefront. Each of them was the dungeon spirit of the Mammon family with tremendous power. Neither the traps nor Stravadi's dungeon spirits could not stop them. The passage, which was inevitably narrow because it was a labyrinth, rather empowered the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon. Stravadi's dungeon spirits had to confront the enemies they couldn't deal with properly. They could not make use of anything like a numerical advantage in this fight. Of course, to prepare for this kind of situation, there was always supposed to be a gathering place in the dungeon, along with a special force specialized in destroying the enemy's elite force. Stravadi's special force was strong. Trained only for the purpose of fighting at the gathering place, they could defeat any outside attackers who were twice as strong as they were. But there was one problem. The dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon were strong, and too strong at that. It was no exaggeration to say that they were strong enough to be called the Masters' Alliance. Rather, Strong Masters' Alliance. Stravadi's labyrinth was neutralized. The traps and dungeon spirits there were incapacitated. He could stick it out if only one of them was functioning, because he had sized up the power of the House of Mammon early on. But when both of them proved useless before Yong-ho's forces, he could do nothing to defend against them. Even this time, his combat calculations went wrong. Stravadi opened his eyes. Once again, he repressed his anger and stood up from the throne. The risk of his next strategy was high because he failed to wear down the Mammon forces, contrary to his expectations, but he had to carry it out. He had no other choice. We're going to destroy them one by one. Everybody, stand by in your position. At his order, the Four Knights swallowed in extreme tension, then hurriedly got out of the Demon King's room. Under his plan, he intended to capture each of the dungeon spirits of the Mammon family, then kill those powerful enough to equal the head of the Master's coalition too, weaken the Master of the House of Mammon while growing his own power. First of all, let me get rid of that grey-haired girl. Chapter 173, Dungeon Breakthrough 5. The white-haired dark elf moved too fast. Moreover, she always stayed with the head of the Mammon family as if she was his escort knight. The red beast and wild animal always paired to attack the enemy. As they moved in sync with each other, it was difficult to catch only one of them. The wizard that dismantled the traps did not go forward. Like the dark elf girl, he also did not distance himself from the master of the Mammon family. The skeleton knight was also threatening. The essence of the undead with the energy of death could not be absorbed in the usual way. So, given the priorities, it was the last one. In terms of elimination of the enemy, what was left now was the grey-haired girl. Apart from it, there were many more reasons to single out the girl with grey hair. She always took the lead in the attack. Because of the way she attacked splendidly in many ways, she often distanced herself from other dungeon spirits. Besides, her mana was powerful. If one ate it, one could expect a significant increase in horsepower. Stravati once again communicated with the souls of the dungeon. He looked straight ahead and activated his power. He jumped through space. Combination magic, gust of ice. The fierce wind caused by Tigrius struck low on the floor. It pushed away not only the energy of dark green poison that leaked out of the wall, but also froze the whole thing. Eligos and Ophelia ran around side by side. Although the gathering place was quite spacious, it was a disaster for Stravati's dungeon spirits because it was indoors. They could not escape anywhere from the beasts running wild to attack them right before their eyes. Young-ho stood in the rear of the gathering area and watched his dungeon spirits fight. He was refraining himself from trying to do anything other than finding the right passage with the power of greed. He needed to save his energy to confront Stravati and Sagatanas, who were likely to exist in the deepest part of this dungeon. Catalina, too, did not get into the fight for the same reason. Skull was also on standby in the rear, just commanding his unit. Among the dungeon spirits of the Mammon family, only 3 were currently actively fighting: Eligos, Ophelia, and Kaiwan. And in fact, it was difficult to say that even they were doing their best. "Hey, make my day! Come on if you dare!" Shouting loudly, Kaiwan wielded her witch sword. The sword, which was only stretched long enough to reach the ceiling of the gathering place, tore everything caught in its blade. It was safe to say that the blade was like a whirlpool. While the terrible massacre was going on, Stravati's special force didn't lose their fighting spirit. Since they went through repeated brainwashing, they were never afraid of death. They willingly sacrificed themselves to inflict any damage to the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon. A series of big explosions continued here and there in the gathering area. It was suicide bombing by Stravati's special force. Eligos and Ophelia, who were fighting the special force in close range, hurriedly moved their hands and feet to protect themselves from the explosion. Tigrius, once again, caused a strong wind to push out the flames and heat of the explosion. Kaiwan was also caught in the explosion. She wasn't injured a bit because she quickly opened the barrier of distortion, but she couldn't help it when her vision was instantly blocked at the explosion. Kaiwan momentarily hung her sword loose to catch her breath. She waited for the dust ahead to scatter at the wind caused by Tigrius. Right at that moment, she breathed out long. Catalina yelled at her suddenly like lightning. "Kaiwan." It was because she sensed that something threatening was approaching Kaiwan. However, her warning rather backfired. The moment Kaiwan instinctively looked back at Catalina, her blind spot became even bigger. After all, she allowed the opponent to attack her. Stravati jumped over space. At the moment Kaiwan and Catalina's eyes crossed, he already landed behind Kaiwan's back. As soon as he snatched her waist, he opened up his mana. It was a silent roar. It resonated throughout the whole gathering place. Stravati's harsh mana suppressed. Kaiwan Stravati Young-ho yelled, "Catalina, hit the ground!" Kaiwan looked at Stravati's arms around her waist. And Stravati also looked at the point where he started. Then he activated the power of jump. The power of jump was not invincible. Although he could jump as long as 600 meters, he had a decisive weakness: the place within his vision. He could only make a space jump, only toward that place. Catalina's moonlight sword cut through the air. Stravati, who appeared from the exit of the gathering point, activated his power in succession without delay. By changing the dungeon terrain through the soul of the dungeon, he secured his own vision while blocking the Mammon Force's vision. He jumped through space exactly 7 times. When his space leap was over, Stravati was standing at the last gathering point on the 3rd floor in the basement. Kaiwan, who was exposed to his space leap without any consideration, felt dizzy severely, and he made the 8th space leap. Stravati appeared 4 meters away from the place where Kaiwan twisted and swung her whip sword. Stravati saw Kaiwan, who turned lightly and crashed on the floor according to the law of gravity. He immediately came up with the next move. The souls of the dungeon injected mana into the gathering place. Then, A powerful curse of magic was activated from the gathering place. The 4 knights, who had already arrived and waited in advance, also strengthened the power of the curse by activating their own magic techniques. It was the most basic, and therefore the most effective curse of weakening the opponent. Chwiryong shuddered. Although she thought she had to open up her mana to release the curse, her mind had a way of its own. It was because the poison of Nagaraja spread all over her body. Perhaps she was poisoned when Stravati held her back. Moreover, Stravati didn't put Chwiryong down anywhere. It was no exaggeration to say that the spot where she fell was a poison pool. Tall and skinny, Stravati was a man like a snake, with an intelligent-looking face underneath a brownish blonde. He made a light smile for the first time since the dungeon battle began. All 5 horns protruding above his ears trembled slightly. His overwhelming mana, that he increased dramatically by taking the essence of Sagatanas, filled the inside of the gathering area. Chwiryong bit her lips. She managed to open her horns, then immediately activated the power of distortion. As if a turtle was hiding in a house, she protected her entire body with a hemispherical shield of distortion. It seemed that she was determined to give up fighting and stick it out. Stravati clicked his tongue and shook his head. He thought her action was truly useless. He felt that her action could buy her only a little time, and he could tear the weakened shield apart with his powerful mana. "Let me devour you, BT. Instead of cursing at him, Chwiryong kept concentrating. She was not sure how many times she would be able to withstand Stravati's attack, but she needed to buy some time by all means. Stravati drew a small sword and struck the shield of distortion with all his power from the beginning. Exactly 3 times. Chwiryong vomited blood with a painful groan because the shield of distortion that she barely maintained was broken. Nagaraja's poison injured her intestines. Stravati acted rationally. He wasn't going to waste his time harassing Chwiryong needlessly. He trampled all over her abdomen with his shoes on. After fixing her so that she could not move, he aimed at her chest with his sword. At that moment, the ceiling exploded. The flow of mana flowing in the gathering ground was cut off. The curse was destroyed. The 4 knights screamed in horror, looking at the broken ceiling. Stravati also turned around. He couldn't stand it anymore. He became irrational and shouted at the opponent in anger. "What the heck happened? How could you chase me like this? How?" The gathering site was supposed to block the flow of his mana from leaking outside, and it was impossible for Yongho's forces to chase him with the mana released from his dungeon spirits. Did he find out the passage? It was also impossible. It wasn't through the proper path that they moved from the basement on the 2nd floor to the 3rd floor. Obviously, they could do it by reversely using Stravati's own power to leap to a space in a strange place. But how could they chase him, and in such a short time at that? Yongho looked ahead before answering. The smoke of greed, tied in only one strand, engulfed Chwiryong in the gathering place densely. Chwiryong smiled in pain, and Yongho spoke a little brazenly. "Well, it's because she is mine." "What did you say?" Stravati asked back blankly. Instead of answering, Yongho stretched out his right hand into the air. Then he grabbed Aemon, the magic spear of the Red Lotus. He instinctively moved on to the next step. The moment the spear of flames appeared in the air, Stravati left the place by exercising his power. It was the right decision. The sword of a dark elf girl, not the master of the Mammon family, flew like a beam of light and pierced the air. Stravati, who jumped to the end of the room at once, summoned the 4 knights through ritual, not words. Armed with full plate armor, the 4 knights quickly gathered next to Stravati and prepared for defense against her attack. The dark elf girl held the grey-haired girl in her arms and left the place, and their void was instantly filled by the master of the Mammon family and his 2 dungeon spirits, namely the red beast and the wild animal. It happened in a few seconds. Stravati tried to recover his reason. He suppressed his emotions and thought about this attack. There was only one answer. Stop the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon. He spoke low. In fact, he made the decision from the moment he decided to have it out with the House of Mammon at the dungeon battle. Although the battle unfolded very differently from what he had intended in the first place, he didn't care, because what mattered to him was the results he had in mind. The dungeon was Stravati's own territory. The souls of the dungeon informed him about the situation around it. Not all of the dungeon spirits of the Mammon family came here for the fight. The wizard and the skeleton knights had yet to arrive at this room. Only the red beast and the wild animal stood by the master of the House of Mammon. The dark elf girl, presumed to be his escort knight, was moving toward the wizard and the skeleton knights with the severely injured grey-haired girl. The situation wasn't bad for Stravati. The souls of the dungeon issued an alarm urgently. All the remaining spirits in the dungeon were about to gather here. Chapter 14, Dungeon Breakthrough 6. Besides, the red beast and wild animal were most heavily used among the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon. Although Stravati failed to wear them down completely as he planned, it was beneficial to him to confirm that they were in their best shape now. With the help of the 4 knights, who became stronger like him, he would be able to hold the red beast and wild animal in check, even if he could not defeat them. It is not reasonable to defeat them in a pincer movement. It wasn't good for him to attack them with 4 knights through a pincer movement. It was more efficient for him to block the red beast and the wild animal and have a one-on-one duel with the master of the Mammon family. Stravati thought quickly. At his order, the 4 knights stared at the red beast and wild animal as if they were fully determined. Yong-ho, the master of the Mammon family, faced Stravati and 4 knights. Instead of wielding armor, he said, "You ate Sargatanas, right?" Although Yong-ho got suspicious when he first heard it from the Nagaraja master who surrendered, he was convinced that Stravati really killed him and took his essence. Stravati twisted his lips and said, "Yes, that's correct. Let me show you the results of it now." He already opened 5 horns. However, this was not his best weapon. Stravati took a step toward Yong-ho. He awakened Nagaraja's blood in his body. The snake's heart began to pound and transform Stravati into a more combative shape. Blue serpent scales sprang on the back of his face and arms. Stravati took another step. This time, the souls of the dungeon reacted to it. They instilled dungeon mana into Stravati, but this alone couldn't increase his mana, but it was possible to recover his mana. It was like providing Stravati with a mana recovery tank of tremendous capacity. Stravati felt greatly uplifted. With the serpent's heart, he didn't have any guilt for Sargatana's death in the first place. All he felt was something like a sense of loss and a little anger from the fact that he killed Sargatanas, whom he loved. But now he didn't feel even such feelings. Why was he so obsessed with the fighting calculations? What the heck was he afraid of? Wasn't he perhaps the strongest master in the abandoned southern area? With such mighty power, Stravati's mana filled the gathering place again. It was mana filled with chill. Stravati laughed confidently. The 4 knights also admired his great power. But at that moment, Yong-ho opened up his mana fully. With Yong-ho's 5 horns soaring, his mana arose like flames, and the green flames devoured the cold energy of Stravati that was filling the inside of the gathering place. His fierce mana was like an explosion. Even without the battle of strength, it roughly crushed Stravati's mana. The 4 knights made an embarrassed expression. Moreover, Yong-ho's attack was not yet over. Light came from the magic field on his left hand and Brigada. 2 of the 7 claws that made up the heart of the demon god bit Yong-ho's heart at the same time, and it brought out stronger power than now. Stravati's mana was just huge. On the other hand, Yong-ho's mana was swirling violently. It was like a strong storm. The moment Yong-ho stepped forward instantly, the tide was turned. His fully uplifted feelings a moment ago were shattered completely. It wasn't just the difference between the power of their mana. In terms of the absolute amount of mana, Yong-ho lagged behind Stravati. With the advantage of the dungeon fight, Stravati was in a much more favorable position. Nevertheless, he was overwhelmed by Yong-ho. Unlike the 4 knights who were scared of the wall that suddenly appeared before their eyes, Stravati quickly understood why. Therefore, he experienced much more fluctuations in his emotions. The strength of Yong-ho's mana was different from his. It also differed qualitatively, not quantitatively. Bang! There was an explosion. It was the sound of Yong-ho, Eligos, and Ophelia rushing toward him with full force at the same time. Absorbed into thoughts, Stravati could not react immediately. Besides, he even thought of something that he should have not at this moment. Can I win? The gap in their fighting abilities widened further. Now it was irreversible. Kang Eligos and Ophelia struck the 4 knights. Hard Eligos fists smashed not only the wall and floor, but also the knight's armor. Ophelia's attack was much more elegant, but fatal at the same time. One of the knights who were overwhelmed by Yongho's mana was kicked in his chest. Since he couldn't even stand it, he was pushed back and collided with the wall. The noise of his clash resonated through the gathering place. Stravadi leaped through space. Faced with a close call, he could avoid Yongho's blow by exercising his power. But that was it. Stravadi moved only to escape, not avoid his attack. At the same time, Hamon pierced the air Yongho turned. He was guided by the experiences he gained through numerous fights. He released black mana from his left arm and grabbed Stravadi, who just finished making a space jump. Then he threw Stravadi down on the floor even before the latter regained power to leap through space again. Stravadi moaned in pain from the shock transmitted from his back. No matter how powerful his mana was, he was bound by the body after all. There was a brief pause. When Stravadi repressed his pain and opened his eyes, Yongho already finished taking the next step. Greatly expanded, black mana blurred Stravadi's vision and blocked his space jump. Bang! Hamon was riding on black mana, and its burning spear pierced Stravadi's abdomen. An unbearable pain seized Stravadi. His strong Nagaraja body survived the shock, but his mental shock was still there. Stravadi acted instinctively. He exercised his power to escape the pain. He didn't do it after some careful thinking. Because of this, he couldn't do anything like adjusting his distance with his opponent or his location. He looked at something in the dimming darkness and threw himself into that place. Stravadi felt the sense of soaring in the air and falling down at the same time. Since the burning spear disappeared, he felt like a burden was lifted, though just a little bit. Yongho grabbed him by the neck. Once again, Stravadi was bumped against the floor. Moreover, this time, his head was hit first. He couldn't open his eyes properly, and even if he did, the only thing he could see was the floor. Mana, magic, and power. With these three factors, Stravadi could escape the current situation. But he needed time to escape, but Yongho did not allow it. Yongho pierced Stravadi's waist with his left hand. A shield of distortion spread out from the hole in the side that Amon had already pierced. Stravadi couldn't even scream. When Yongho's hand bounced from the wound like a rocket, Stravadi's belly was a mess. The wounds opened wider, and the pressed intestines were torn and crushed. There was no such thing as an elegant gladiator match. Even the close battle between the rival masters with equal mana didn't take place. Yongho concentrated his magic on his right hand. Just as Stravadi suppressed Kaiwan's mana, he instinctively blasted Stravadi's mana, who was struggling to survive. The gathering place was shaken. It looked as if the whole dungeon was moaning. Yongho moved his hand again. Though the situation now was overwhelmingly favorable to him, he didn't let his guard down. The dungeon was still injecting mana into Stravadi. His Nagaraja body quickly rebuilt itself, even though the placenta of his intestines was crushed. That was why Yongho had to keep attacking. Yongho held Aemon short with his left hand. He then made a new hole by stabbing Stravadi's back multiple times. Stravadi struggled once again but never escaped Yongho's attacks. Yongho did the terrible thing repeatedly. After releasing Amon in the air again, he put his left hand into the hole. Using the power of distortion, he destroyed Stravadi's body. His skin with scales swelled greatly. His bones, pressed down by the distortion of the shield, were broken. His lung was also maimed, gushing blood. Since his heart, one of the gathering points of mana, was busted, the speed of his body's restoration was also slow. Yongho grabbed his right hand, then put his left hand on his body that was devastated like a piece of rags after he crushed Stravadi's snake-like neck. He grabbed Amon with his right hand for the final blow. Stravadi wriggled. The souls of the dungeon squeezed out mana to inject it into Stravadi, but it was all in vain. Hamon, giving off extreme heat, pierced the back of Stravadi's head and burned his head with the green flames. Master one of the four knights shouted. Struggling against Eligos and Ophelia, they felt their mana drastically dwindled. Since their owner Stravadi was killed, their connection was also cut off. Yongho was also convinced of Stravadi's death. Letting out a long sigh, he stopped using mana. Then he deactivated the heart of the demon god, which was straining the spirit and body of the dungeon spirits, and took the next step. Stravadi died without showing his abilities properly. He didn't properly use his mighty mana. nor did he show off his swordsmanship well known among the Eastern masters. He also didn't make the best use of his secret card of Nagaraja Mana and the power of Space Leap. But Yong-ho was not interested in them. Since he fought and won, it was time for him to reap the results of his victory. Stravadi's mana, which was equal to 5 horns. It could be called the combined mana of those masters who once existed in the eastern and northern regions. Eligos and Ophelia turned. As they were virtually born and raised in the southern area, they instinctively realized that what would happen from now on was not simply for the winning master to absorb the essence of the defeated master, the abandoned southern area. As the name implied, it was a land without an owner. It had always been divided since the times of Mammon, the great king of greed. It was not abandoned anymore. The era of a new king would finally unfold after 1,000 years of a long break. Yong-ho expressed intense greed. He ate all the essence that Stravadi had. The king of the unclaimed territory. A crow chirped. Watching Stravadi's dungeon, it contained information in its black eyes. Then it flew away, making a big chirping noise. The unclaimed land in the south was unified finally. Although he had not yet combined all the power available, he could unite the essence of mana. The king of the unclaimed territory, Citri said. She raised herself in the black silence. Instead of digging through old memories, she witnessed what happened now. What would all this change bring about? Timed with the war in the north, Citri shook her head. She got all her inferences out of her mind. She just followed her pure feelings now. She realized she was happy about the outcomes of the battle. Mammon. The nostalgic name warmed her heart. She smiled brightly like a girl. When would Yong-ho come to see her? She didn't hide her excitement. She gently pressed her chest and closed her eyes. She looked forward to seeing him. Chapter 175. King of the Unclaimed Land 1. The fight in the northern area was unfolding differently from what the King of Fury expected. The King of Fury initially thought that the fight in the north would soon escalate into a great war, but it was not. The King of Pride attacked slowly and steadily, as if the only kings in the world were himself and the King of Envy. He felt like he was engaged in a one-on-one duel with the King of Envy without the third party. The King of Lust, whose territory faced the borders with the territory of the King of Envy, did not move in the harem at all while the two kings were fighting each other. He did not help the King of Envy to repel the King of Pride, nor did he ambush the King of Envy who was in a head-to-head battle with the King of Pride. The King of Fury, who led his troops and camped on the northern borders, felt frustrated. As a king with pacifist leanings, she obviously did not want a world war, but it didn't mean that she was satisfied with the current situation. Although the King of Fury was often called a simplistic and ignorant warmonger, she was by no means a fool or a madman. She was just a little more naive and simple than the other kings. The King of Fury soon understood that the northern area was like an active volcano that didn't erupt yet, for she realized why the King of Gluttony was watching the fight as an onlooker, aside from the King of Lust. When she found out the reason, she thought it was really unpleasant. Well, in going to intervene only after they have been exhausted, the King of Fury always thought of the best scenario, and the best one she thought of was that the war in the north itself fizzled out at the beginning. That would be the least damaging to all, but other kings differed on this. That was why they regarded the King of Fury as a foolish king rather than a pacifist. According to their logic, what was important was not to reduce the damage. It didn't matter whether it was the King of Pride or the King of Envy. What they wanted was to stop any king from dominantly accumulating any one of the three, namely essence, godly energy, and sin. The damage unrelated to this was rather an advantage to them. In other words, the damage, in this case, was that of the King of Pride and the King of Envy, not the King of Gluttony himself. Because of this, they didn't care even if the King of Pride overpowered the King of Envy. They would welcome it with open arms if the King of Envy was unilaterally damaged and his force collapsed. So, the King of Fury thought that now was not the time to intervene. There was nothing she would gain by intervening to stop the fight. It was only when their fight was almost at an end that she would decide to intervene. The King of Pride might have found out her intention. The most dangerous moment would be when he beheaded the King of Envy and had everything. In that case, all the other kings would certainly go after the King of Pride, or, if he enlists the help of the King of Envy. And if he succeeded, there would break out a great war at that moment. It would be a war between the king, who took two godly energies and sin, and the other kings. The king of gluttony was confident that he knew quite well about the king of fury. As someone who liked to go to any battlefield, she was so straightforward and simple-minded. Although there were rumors that she was a warmonger, knowledgeable people knew that she had a tough time working for her people, not for her own interests. What bothers me is the king of lust and the king of violence. These two kings would be her prime competitors when the fight between the king of pride and the king of envy came to a head. It's going to be incredibly bloody. The king of gluttony smiled in satisfaction. It was not because of the looming war. It was because of a letter politely delivered by the half-naked Apsaras, one of the beauties of the king of gluttony. The southern unclaimed land was unified. However, other kings couldn't pay attention to the southern land since they cared about the northern territory alone. They couldn't afford to care about the southern land that had been devastated because of Embryo's war. Above all, it had been abandoned for a long time since the time of Mammon. There were no competitors there, so they didn't need to fight each other. The only thing I have to do is to check it out once last time, and if he got the result he wanted, they would see what would happen when the competition started. They would witness the appearance of a great king who has acquired more than two sins for the first time since Mammon, the king of greed. The king of gluttony felt a strong appetite. He beckoned to Apsaras. She hastily rang the bell and prepared dinner for the hungry king. "Hey, that's mine." Seated on a long sofa, Kaiwan shouted, behaving like a snub. As if she felt her message didn't get understood by the other party, she spoke again, changing the way she sat, and in the end she burst into laughter. "It's mine, you know. Oh my gosh. Yes, that's right. Young hoes, young hoes, young hoes. It's been one day since they smashed Stravati." Kaiwan was excited all day long after she was detoxified from Nagaraja's poison, thanks to the special remedy that Skathach had given her before she left for the fight. I wish everyone here had seen Yong Ho's face at that time. He was a man of perfect flames, you know. Anyway, Yong Ho's. Catalina, who was sitting next to her forcibly, pursed up her lips at her repetition of the same words. She let her ears droop several times and tried to balk, though timidly. "Well, also Yong Ho's, don't you know it?" At that moment, everybody was silent. Although Catalina tried to assert herself as brazenly as possible, she puckered her lips again when Kaiwan stopped smiling and stared at her. Blushing, Catalina let her ears and shoulders droop at the same time. Kaiwan glanced at her quietly, then stretched out her hand. She not only pinched Catalina's cheeks, but also hugged her suddenly. "Oh my gosh, so what, my sister? What do I do about it now? You're so cute." As always, Catalina was at a loss about her unexpected reaction. But Kaiwan didn't care and laughed a lot, pulling even her tail. "Yes, you and I are Yong Ho's. Everything here is all his, right?" Kaiwan asked Catalina, who was struggling to get out of her arms. Watching them quietly, Salami shook its head while lying face down. Obviously, Salami thought about something weird. Ophelia shook her head, but with a different nuance from Salamis. She really could not believe that this cheerful woman before her eyes was the former female ruler, Kaiwan, that her father Endelion used to mention. The noble and beautiful woman, who was like a thorny rose. Smiling apologetically at Catalina, who signaled to her for help, Ophelia took her gaze from her and looked at her master, who was absorbed into something. "Do you know, you're turning up your mouth now. Time." "No way, I wonder if you really think you were cool like the dungeon spirit," Kaiwan said when you. Lucia, who took control of Stravadis' dungeon, spoke in a fully assumed voice. Again, Yong Ho ignored her message lightly and displaced Stravadis' dungeon information in the air by teasing his finger. "It's a really big and complex dungeon. It has a long history, but it seems that it has been greatly expanded and renovated recently." Yong Ho nodded. As Lucia said, it was a complex dungeon that made him feel dizzy just by looking at it. Without the power of greed, he would have wandered for several days on the first floor, let alone the third floor in the basement. In my personal opinion, it's a little regrettable to destroy it. There are many good facilities inside, just like the property of a family that built up wealth for a long time. Stravadi's dungeon was well built. Besides, there were several facilities such as the Advanced Training Center for the Masters, the Intermediate Magic Lab, and the Reagent Manufacturing Center that the House of Mammon didn't have. The dungeon whose heart was destroyed was supposed to perish. The moment Yong-ho took its essence to make Lucia grow, this huge dungeon would be thrown into the fate of inevitable death. Because of this, Yong-ho also thought it was regrettable to take it. He really wanted to make this dungeon the forward base of the eastern branch of the House of Mammon, because it was too good to be compared with the small dungeons that he had used as forward bases, but he had no other choice. Actually, one of the main reasons for his expedition to the eastern area was because he wanted to make Lucia grow. At the same time, he couldn't give up the essence of this dungeon, which was much more valuable than a mix of a few small and medium-sized dungeons. I can make Lucia grow anyway. When Lucia grew, he could obtain various facilities in the Labyrinth of Greed. Given that the facilities that he could newly install would also increase, it would soon become a big dungeon like this one. Okay, let me focus on laying the firm foundation for the future dungeon now. The reason he bothered to occupy Stravadis' dungeon was not just for viewing or reference. His main purpose was to collect all kinds of treasures hidden in his dungeon. Chapter 76, King of the Unclaimed Land. 2 gold and silver coins that could be called cash were not found much compared to other goods. However, it was only a relative evaluation. Actually, there were several times as much as the amount of cash that the House of Mammon possessed now. It was Stravadis' personal safe that caught the attention of Yong-ho the most among the treasures in the dungeon. If Yong-ho and Lucia had not taken control of the dungeon, they would have never known its existence itself. Although Yong-ho couldn't be sure what was inside it because he hadn't yet visited the dungeon, just a mere glance at the list of Stravadis' possessions astonished him. Are these pictures? Yong-ho, who did not know more than 5 artists in the human world, could not determine the value of the booty. Besides, paintings were one of the items that were quite difficult to convert into cash. Therefore, he turned his attention to those things that he intuitively found it easy to understand. A fire dragon's teeth, Jin's necklace, Black Mamba's armor set, Chantier collection, no. Tai 11-6, 91-240 Mandarake. Yong-ho was silent for a moment, and he humbly admitted that he couldn't understand their value at all. Like his father advised him, he decided to leave it to Ophelia, an expert in the field. When he put aside the secret safe, there appeared extravagant places such as wine cellars and enormous bathrooms. He once again expressed regret about his decision to dispose of the dungeon when he looked at its huge bathroom, but he stopped at the next place. He said before he knew it, the door of space. It was not used for a long time. It looks like it was built more than 100 years ago. Listening to Lucius' additional explanation distractedly, Yong-ho was seated on the throne. The reason why he momentarily stopped at the door of space was because he recalled something suddenly. Come to think of it, Kaiwan. After pondering over something, he called her immediately. He looked at the sofa, which he had ignored, then flinched for some other reason. It was because he saw Kaiwan pulling Catalina's tail with some kind of menacing look, while holding her with a long face. Luckily, Salome's sullen face in the back helped him wake up to the reality. He slightly turned away from Catalina's desperate glance, which he thought was cute, then asked Kaiwan, "Why did you stop making the door of space in the middle?" Oh, that stuff. Currently, the door of space in the House of Mammon was not newly built by Yong-ho from start to finish. He finished it after picking up where Kaiwan had already built half of it. Why did Kaiwan make the door of space? She didn't answer right away and then puckered her lips. She then leaned against the sofa, rubbing Catalina's tail. She barely opened her mouth. I was a little lonely. I also wanted to get some help. Because I knew about your family. What I mean is the descendants of another Mammon family who exist in the human world. She hid her loneliness with a smile. Then she continued in a lively tone. I saw it in the record. I also heard some from the previous masters I met at the arena. She needed help. She needed somebody she could rely on. Somebody different from those trapped in the arena. She needed an elderly who could help her directly. Someone who will lead her, not just her deputy. Well, who knows, your relatives in the human world may live well. I was thinking of getting some help from them, she said jokingly. Because of her mention of his family in the human world, Yong-ho could also recall some funny episodes. I guess you would have stuffed yourself with chicken there. His grandfather ran a chicken restaurant. Yong-ho heard that it was the best one in his neighborhood. Fortunately, Yong-ho only thought to himself about it. As Yong-ho laughed, Kai-wan, who laughed along with him, touched Catalina's tail again. The reason why I suspended the construction of the door of space in the middle was simple. It took too much more resources and mana than I thought. So, I stopped the construction, thinking of resuming it sometime in the future. Good job, he again thought to himself. It took tremendous resources to construct the door of space. If the only reward she got after constructing the door so hard had been just chicken, Kai-wan would have fallen down with a fit of anger. Kai-wan laughed again and looked at him gently. I suddenly have a bit of regret now. If I had completed the door then, I might have met you earlier. Kai-wan didn't finish her words because she felt somewhat out of place at the moment. It was as many as 30 years ago that Kai-wan served as the master of the House of Mammon. Since she had been held up in the arena during the whole period, she might feel it looked like only yesterday, but it was just a long time ago to others. Suddenly, Kai-wan realized there was a big age difference between them. Going by age in the human world, it would not be strange for people to call her his grandma. Catalina, who quickly found out why Kai-wan was now on the defensive, realized that she had a chance to strike back. She got out of Kai-wan's arms, then said a bit brazenly but timidly, just like her, I'm only in my late 20s and early 30s. Nobody knew exactly how old she was, but she was around that age. If so, she was almost the same age as Yong-ho Master. The 21-year-old Yong-ho turned his eyes away from the two with an effort. Suddenly, she thought of Citri. Right at that moment, Lucia changed the topic as if to save Catalina, who was tilting her head blankly, and Kai-wan, who was in confusion. Master, someone from the dungeon market is here. So currently, Butler Eligos is going out to meet him. From the dungeon market, tilting his head to the side, he looked at Ophelia. She shook her head right away when he glanced at her quizzically, as if to ask her if she bought anything. It wasn't Yong-ho himself who bought stuff there. Since he accessed the dungeon of the Nagaraja Master last time, he had never entered the virtual space of the dungeon market. Eligos directly met an employee of the dungeon market. He doesn't look like a courier, it's a mayor in a black suit. He sent a letter to Eligos. Speaking to him in succession, Lucia created a new screen in the air. It was a video that greatly enlarged the outer envelope of the letter Eligos received. Yong-ho didn't recognize the luxurious outer envelope and the seal stamped in the middle. However, he recognized the pretty thin letters on the bottom of the outer envelope, Samael. She was one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market, who had the fastest wings. It was her letter. Since Stravadi's dungeon structure was so complex, it took more time than expected for Eligos to return. Since he wanted to hand the letter to Yong-ho as soon as possible, Eligos even turned beastly and ran fanatically. Thanks, Eligos. You don't have to overwork yourself like this next time. Eligos deactivated his beastly mechanism and greeted him, a bit embarrassed, because he felt he made a big fuss over it. He had no intention of embarrassing him at all, so he didn't say or ask him anything for fear that things might get complicated. So, he expressed gratitude to him, again sincerely, then headed to the sofa instead of the throne, because there were a lot who wanted to know what was written in the letter. Kai-wan and Catalina naturally arranged a seat for him in the middle. Ophelia was already seated behind the sofa. Only Tigrius, who just returned after being summoned, was in his seat politely. Skull was also seated in the same spot but felt comfortable because it was the floor he was sitting on. When Yong-ho sat between the two women, Ophelia politely held out a knife. It was only for the purpose of opening envelopes. Phew! As he was about to open the letter, Yong-ho got a bit nervous because he felt a bit of mana inside, although the outer layer of the letter was nothing special. In case of an emergency, Yong-ho wrapped the envelope of the letter with mana. He could do it because of his excellent ability to control mana. Watching him doing so from behind, Ophelia smiled happily. There were 2 reasons why she did not examine the letter first this time, like she did when he received the letter from Tigrius, requesting a duel. One of the reasons was that it was unlikely that the dungeon market would harm Yong-ho, and the other was her trust in him. Her owner and master of the House of Mammon was no more a green boy. He was a mighty monarch who unified the whole unclaimed area in the south. Finally, Yong-ho opened the envelope and took out the letter. It was a small black paper in the form of a card that he didn't even need to open. Special auction by the dungeon market. Is this an invitation? While reading the golden letters on the top of the card carelessly, Kaiwan was astonished, startled. She raised her upper body, leaning on Yong-ho Samael, the lady with the fastest wings. Oh my gosh, do you really mean Samael? One of the 5 directors of the dungeon market surprised as much. Ophelia also made a big fuss over the invitation letter from Samael. Even the gentle Tigrius opened his eyes wide with his jaws dropping. 5 directors, Elagos responded belatedly. Catalina, who was embarrassed by the situation where everyone was astonished, pretended to be startled too, because she didn't really know what the 5 directors meant. Fortunately, nobody noticed Catalina's awkward action because everybody fixed their eyes on the invitation in his hand. Inject mana in it. I think it's a video card. Chapter 177. King of the Unclaimed Land. 3. Kaiwan egged on Yong-ho to do it quickly. Ophelia also nodded fiercely behind her back. Although nobody asked him, Tigrius explained it to calm himself down. The 5 directors of the dungeon market are not just dungeon merchants. Each of them is the master of their house with their own dungeon, and apart from their godly energy and sin, their power is considered to be equal to the 6 kings. The difference in power caused by their possession of sin or not was very large. However, they were owners of the dungeon market, whose 5 directors were said to dominate the entire commerce of the demon world. Considering their additional resources, they were strong enough to compete with the 6 kings in terms of their forces. Now, one of these 5 directors sent an invitation directly to Yong-ho. Thanks to Tigrius' explanation, Catalina now understood what was going on, and she got as excited as Kaiwan and Ophelia. Even Salami looked at the invitation in Yong-ho's hand with twinkling eyes. With everyone so tense, Yong-ho injected mana into the invitation. One of the 5 directors of the dungeon market and the general manager of the auction house, Samael, who has the fastest wings, is happy to greet the master of the great house of Mammon. The light emitting from the end of the invitation formed Samael's images. It was about the size of 2 palms put together, which seemed to be just a recorded video of her message. It's not an invitation to everybody. It's an invitation specially sent to you, Yong-ho Kaiwan said in excitement. In fact, she could not help but get thrilled. Samael, one of the 5 directors, directly called him the master of the great house of Mammon Eligos, was moved to tears after a long time. Catalina also flapped her ears with overwhelming emotion. She had tears welled in her eyes. Ophelia understood Eligos and Catalina at this moment. At last, the house of Mammon was recognized. The house of Mammon had become the subject of great scorn after falling over a long period of time. As a result, nobody from the house of Mammon had been invited to the banquet of the demon kings in the southern area. Joining them belatedly, Ophelia's chest filled out. Eligos and Catalina, who had experienced hard times by themselves, had a lump in their throats. Deeply moved by the invitation, Kaiwan broke down in tears, though a little bit. Although she couldn't make it when she was the master of the house of Mammon, she was so happy about Yong-ho's great achievement. Besides, it was her master and lover, Yong-ho, who was formally recognized. Samael in the video continued. There is a special auction scheduled to be held in 7 days. I hope that the master of the house of Mammon can attend the auction by all means. We will prepare all the conveniences for your visit here. If you are willing to participate, please feel free to use the summon scroll attached to the invitation. Our staffer will go and see you. After directly telling him the message, Samael gracefully showed her manners. Then she said goodbye with an angelic smile. I look forward to seeing you again. The video was over. Kaiwan asked right away, did she say she was looking forward to seeing you again? Have you met her before? Also 5 directors. Yeah, a few days ago. After answering her question quickly, he examined the envelope a little more closely. Indeed, there was a scroll of the same size as the invitation. At that moment, Kaiwan hugged his arm and brought her face closer to him. She didn't do it to express her affection, but wanted him to tell more about his meeting with Samael instead of being distracted by something else. Since Catalina and other dungeon spirits agreed with her, Yong-ho put down the invitation. Then, he puckered his lip for a moment as if to choose his words, then said, well, I met her in a virtual space by chance. She and I were waiting for Citri at that time. Citri, that lady of the dungeon market. Again this time, Kaiwan expressed a big interest. Catalina and Eligos, surprised, blinked their eyes. Yongho nodded and said, "Yes, you're right, Citri. She was the dungeon merchant who helped all the previous masters of the House of Mammon before they formally inaugurated. But she usually paid little attention to any other master than Kaiwan. Maybe Citri is also one of the 5 directors." "Are you sure Citri is also a director?" Eligos' voice trembled. With her eyes open wide, Catalina also couldn't say anything. Yongho hesitated for a moment because Eligos and Catalina looked so groggy at the moment. However, he decided to continue because he already opened his mouth. This time, he revealed something more surprising, and Citri is one of the women affiliated with the House of Mammon. "How should I call her properly? Should I say she is my grandma?" Eligos was completely frozen. But Catalina sprang to her feet and shouted, "That woman with red hair, the woman who always tormented Alun. Anyway, she was a witch who was one of Mammon's lovers. Citri also had red hair," Ophelia explained on behalf of Eligos, who lost his mind at the moment. "I told you about it once before. Mammon had so many women. However, there were 2 special women among them. One was Alun, who was Mammon's escort knight, and the other was a red-haired witch whose name was unknown." Yongho recalled his ancestor Kumiho, or the 9-tailed fox, but he didn't mention the name Kaiwan, leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "That's why." Perhaps Kaiwan was thinking of her memories about Citri. Given that Citri called Kaiwan a nasty but cute girl, they must have a pretty good relationship. "Anyway, it's the auction house. Right. I heard that the Dungeon Market auction house was not just a place for auctions. Just like the regular banquets of the Demon Kings held in the southern area, it is a meeting place where the Demon Kings, who would never see each other normally, meet and rub shoulders." Regaining his composure, Tigrius explained in a quiet voice. Ophelia also added, "It's a place for them to relax. They can avoid conflict through direct conversation." "Yes, that's right. But they were held once every few years." Yongho understood why Catalina and Eligos broke into tears. The former master of the House of Mammon, who committed suicide because he could not bear the shame, had been totally ignored not only by other masters, but also by the Dungeon Market. So, it was natural that all of them were deeply moved when one of the 5 directors of the Dungeon Market, the highest executive body, recognized the House of Mammon. However, it was natural that they were choked up with emotions because one of the 5 directors of the Dungeon Market recognized the House of Mammon. Perhaps their sorrow buried deep in their hearts must have exploded. Does it mean that the Dungeon Market is not a typical marketplace? Based on the details about the Dungeon Market so far, the Dungeon Market was not obsessed with simply selling things. Just like a government that cared about the welfare of its people, the Dungeon Market had worked in various ways for the peace and well-being of the demon world. For example, they provided food at low prices or took measures of easing tensions, as Tigrius mentioned. If you want to sell something, you have to have someone to buy it. Maintaining a huge society called the Demon World is also beneficial to the Dungeon Market because they can sell more in that environment, said Ophelia. Her answer had a point. Without demand, there was neither supply nor profit generation. After all, it's money, isn't it? Don't we have enough money? Yong-ho spoke carelessly, but Ophelia responded quickly, contrary to his expectation. Well, you are not supposed to say it since you are the king of greed. She didn't say it just because of her merchant spirit. Yong-ho was none other than the king of greed. Money, woman, power. These are something anybody who has desire wants to pursue. No matter how much they have, they are never satisfied. And that desire was the source of Yong-ho's power. How could the king of greed say he had got enough money already? Yong-ho, who nodded on impulse, felt that Catalina and Kaiwan were pulling each of his arms firmly. Catalina was about to cry, with her ears drooping, and Kaiwan was staring at him ferociously after a long time. Although they looked at him differently, they seemed to see eye to eye on Ophelia's rebuke. Hey, stop it. Yong-ho cleared his throat at that moment and hastily changed the topic. Anyway, I think I have to decide whether to accept the invitation or not. He then looked at the card again. Tigrius said, I think it is a great opportunity for you to broaden your knowledge. Although there was an all-out war going on in the north, I think powerful guys from the demon world will gather at the auction house because they offer special auctions. this time. You bet. Yong-ho recalled the time when he and Sitri attended the auction house. It was a good experience. Since he was exposed to a wider world back then, he could reach a higher level. Without his growth at that time, he would not have made what he is today. Yong-ho himself did not exist. Moreover, I got Brigada at that time. There was no one against him obtaining another good item this time. Rather, better auction items might be waiting for him. Okay, the only thing I have to do now is to get things done before I attend the auction house. In the eastern area, there were still some dungeons of Sagatanas and small and medium-sized dungeons. Yong-ho could own them easily if he decided to. Even if there were good auction items, he would not be able to buy them without money. So, it was time for him to collect all the money available to participate in the auction house. His eyes shone with greed, and Armin, watching silently, was relieved. His greed was still strong. Chapter 158. King of the Unclaimed Land. 4. Exactly a week after he received the invitation, Yong-ho took over the dungeons of Stravadi and Sagatanas, then stood at the entrance to the dungeon of the Nagaraja Master. Chwiryong and Catalina, fully dressed up, stood on his left and right side while the rest of his dungeon spirits saw him off, standing at the entrance. The dungeon market kept their time, as always. Over the sky where the sunset began to set, a flying wagon of the dungeon market appeared. Wow! Catalina, who unwittingly gave an exclamation of surprise, flapped her ears and tail because the flying wagon of the dungeon market was so beautiful. It was a white, streamlined carriage resembling a shining moonlight. But what drew her interest, in particular, was the 6 Pegasus pulling the carriage. She felt like it was even holy, thanks to the bright moonlight behind the carriage stepping down from the sky. The carriage safely landed on the ground. Sitting on the coach box was an incubus, well dressed in a neat suit. Half the subordinates of Samael with the fastest wings were mares, and the other half were harpies. Those in charge of external affairs were mostly mares among them. The incubus, who jumped gently from the coach box, expressed due manners to Yong-ho by deeply bowing, then opened the carriage door. There was a familiar face inside the almond-like flat oval carriage. "Dear client, it seems you have a thicker skin now. Never did I think you would have a big shot like me come over here like this." Wearing an alluring red evening dress, Sitri spoke quite sharply, but she had a smile in her eyes and lips. Yong-ho also smiled at her and replied slyly, "Thank you for your help, Sitri." "Well, you're welcome because you are my dear client. By the way, you have a cool cheek. Don't look innocent. I liked you better when you were more fresh and cute." Yong-ho had nothing to say this time other than smiling bitterly. Even Tigrius and Elagos, who knew how to be politically correct, didn't blame her rudeness. It wasn't because she was one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market. She was once Mammon's lover, the great king of greed. In some respects, she was doting on him as if he was her grandson, so they couldn't blame her. Sitri Chwiryong, who was standing next to Yong-ho, carefully called Sitri. Although Chwiryong didn't bat an eyelid typically, she was nervous this time, with her eyes trembling already. It was because she was worried that Sitri might not welcome her. Sitri saw her. Then she opened her eyes wide and opened her arms in no time. She said kindly, "Oh, cute client, it's been a long time. Can I hug you?" Chwiryong couldn't stand it anymore. She jumped into the wagon even before she was done greeting her. Then she hugged Sitri suddenly. "Sitri, you are still acting like a spoiled child." Sitri stroked Chwiryong's head and back over and over again, who was held in her arms like a child. Although all the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon were watching her, Chwiryong wept, rubbing her cheeks against Sitri's chest. Sitri was like an older sister and mother to Chwiryong as a child who had been earnestly looking for an adult she could follow. Moreover, she met Sitri today after several decades. Sitri hugged her tightly as if it was inevitable, then glanced at Yong-ho, signaling to him to get into the carriage quickly. "Okay, let me leave now. See you back at the house." Yong-ho was going to return to the House of Mammon right from the auction house. Since he got all the large dungeons in the eastern area and cashed out all the extraordinary items at the dungeon market, he had no reason to stay there anymore. It was important for him to develop the dungeon of the Mammon family before confronting the King of Gluttony. "I hope you have a pleasant journey." Tigrius spoke on behalf of the dungeon spirits, while Elagos and Ophelia saw off Yong-ho with a smile. Fluffy cushions were arranged in an oval shape inside the carriage. Since Citri and Kaiwan were sitting right across the door, Yong-ho sat with Catalina on the left side of the door. Kaiwan wore a black evening dress that highlighted her white skin so much that she could be even said to look pale, and Catalina wore a white evening dress as if she wanted to be in contrast with Kaiwan in costume color. As soon as the carriage door closed, Citri said, "Let me tell you this, for caution's sake, don't leave me at this auction. Avoid using the power of greed as much as possible." "Got it. Yes, I hope him in your good hands," Yong-ho answered cheerfully. It was natural he did so because she was right here after accepting his request. "I don't think Samael invited you with bad intentions. She's too sincere for that." He was very satisfied with Samael's invitation itself. He was also pleased that Samael, one of the 5 directors, officially recognized the House of Mammon. However, Yong-ho did not let his guard down. Normally, he would have accepted the invitation, but the situation was different now. "The King of Gluttony will visit you." This was the warning from Embryo. The special auction organized by the Dungeon Market was attended by lots of influential figures in the demon world. It was very unlikely that the king would come to this occasion directly, but it was possible that the king's close aide would attend. Yong-ho did not want to expose himself to them. He thought that Samael had 2 reasons for calling him. One of the reasons was that she invited him with pure motivations. The House of Mammon was no longer a collapsing small family. It was an unrivaled, powerful family that they could equate any comparable family with, let alone an adversary in the southern area. Yong-ho might be conceited about this, but even Citri agreed on this point. And the other reason Samael called him was because of Citri, as he thought. I think she did it out of curiosity. She might have been curious because Samael, who was always stuck in her house, showed interest in a man. For example, she might think like this: "What's so special about this man that this big shot of our dungeon market has to deal with?" That's my guess. Yong-ho smiled bitterly, and Kaiwan, still held tightly in Citri's arms, wouldn't move. At that moment, he felt a sense of floating and speed at the same time. The 6 Pegasus pulling the carriage began to speed up ferociously. "Oh my God. Make sure all of you wear this on your arms because you have to hide the power of Brigada." Citri pulled out 3 silver bracelets from her cleavage and gave them to the 3. It was a plain bracelet with the same shape as one on Citri's arm. Brigada, also called God's Metal, was special. However, it was only when it came into the hands of the king and his dependents that its special power was in motion. If anyone wore accessories made with Brigada, it was most likely that he was a king or his dependent. Brigada itself is a fairly hard and light metal, so it was common to make spears without knowing it was Brigada, but it was very rare to make jewelry with it. Wearing Brigada accessories was like wearing metal trousers. So, Yong-ho needed to hide his Brigada first, in order to conceal the fact that he was the king of greed. At first, he thought about not wearing a Brigada at all, but it was unreasonable because of the heart of the demon god. Unlike the ring, the heart of the demon god was not something that could be worn or taken out freely. If you wear this bracelet, Brigada's performance will be weakened. So be sure to unfasten the bracelet when necessary. Got it. Yong-ho and Catalina wore the bracelets with a nod. Kaiwan asked, "How about you, Citri? It will make me look weird if I don't wear it when you guys are wearing it, right?" With a chuckle, Citri pinched Kaiwan on the cheek. At first glance, it was like an older sister, and her sister was playing friendly. If I did so, she would be definitely mad at me, Catalina thought. In fact, Kaiwan liked to pinch her cheeks and touch her tail or ears, but when she tried to do the same, Kaiwan always reacted sharply. But now she just smiled shyly when Citri touched her. She was like a cat asking for a little more petting. Citri said again, "This auction is a little bit bigger than the auction you participated in the other day. In addition to the official auction organized by Samael, we have also prepared exhibition-style free auctions." "Exhibition-style?" Catalina asked, flapping her ears. Citri responded kindly as always. "To put it more directly, I would say it's like a market. We put several items in the auction house at the same time and sell them. If you find an item you want to purchase, you can bid higher than the maximum price of the item at that time. It is an auction style that allows the person bidding the highest price within the deadline to take the item. If you don't want to wait until the bidding ends, you can buy the item at the seller's price directly." The flying wagon jumped into space. Just like the cat carriage did the other day, this one also narrowed a huge distance at once. "Here are the masks I prepared." After peeking out the window for a moment, Citri opened the box that was located between the cushions. Before handing them out, Citri put on a lioness mask on her head. Yongho received a male lion mask with a mane, while Catalina and Kaiwan received a dog and cat mask, respectively. Somehow, the three masks befitted them very well. As you already know, since you visited here last time, there are many ways to identify the person, even if you cover your face with a mask. Please keep that in mind. After giving them a gentle reminder, she buried her body deep in the cushion as if she had nothing to say anymore. Yongho looked out the window of the carriage like he did last time. He had a panoramic view of the gorgeous auction house in his eyes. Chapter 179, King of the Unclaimed Land. 5. This time, Yongho entered the auction house proudly, unlike the last time when he had to sneak in through the back door. He confidently entered the main door and felt a little joy while wearing the male lion's mask. He felt different from what he did before. The violet mana that swirled randomly like a blind sword was still the same. It was still swirling roughly inside the auction house, but he didn't feel that it was burdensome anymore. He could ignore it naturally, as if he was facing a breeze. It wasn't just because Yongho understood his own mana better than before. The reason was simple. His mana became strong. He was different from the time when he had to look up at the dark sky. This time, Yongho himself was in the sky. He could look down, and he didn't feel the sky above his head just far away. Even now, after having absorbed Stravardis mana, he had only 5 horns. Actually, they were close to 6. In other words, he reached a stage where he had to realize a new wall that he should overcome. Catalina, who obtained 5 horns after Kaiwan, felt the same way as Yongho. She felt a little joy in her comfort. When this auction starts, it is highly likely that Samael will greet you directly. Until then, feel free to enjoy the free auction. Citrus whispering tickled Yongho's ears. He flinched unwittingly, then quickly nodded and moved to the free auction house. Catalina and Kaiwan followed him closely. The free auction house reminded him of an exhibition, as Citri said. It looked like an exhibition with all kinds of items lined up along the wall. Devil nails. Anyone who bled, hit by a devil's nails, is cursed by a powerful devil. Anyone with a demon curse suffers from a demon's mental attack. Not only your concentration, but also your overall physical ability decreases, and the effect varies depending on the strength and weakness of your mental power. If you are both mentally and physically exhausted, you might be killed at once. Additionally, it's highly likely that it will cause fear in the other person. In order to maintain the devil's curse, you must constantly supply mana. Kaiwan's eyes glared when she was looking at a red dagger. It was very peculiar, because not only its handle but also its blade was very red. How about this? Don't you think it's going to be quite useful? Yongho, who was looking at the area next to only 2 cells from the devil's nails, responded awkwardly. When Kaiwan turned around, there was an elf spirit with a slim body for sale. Given that the elf had a chain around his neck, it looked like he was a slave from another world. Kaiwan narrowed her eyes wide with a long face, while Yongho began to eagerly examine the devil's nails. Meanwhile, Catalina, flapping her ears and tail together, was staring intently at one of the rings. Dead Spirit Ring. It uses a nearby corpse to create a skeleton-type undead. However, skeletons created in this way are destroyed as soon as mana is not supplied anymore. If there is enough mana supplied, it is also possible to make corpses automatically undead within the range. Catalina recalled a smiling skull in her mind. Wouldn't it be very effective if Skull went to the battlefield with this ring? It looks okay, but it seems that its mana efficiency is bad. Why don't you get a necromancer-based familiar spirit? Catalina checked the bidding prices. The bidding price was not high, as if its efficiency was not good enough, like Citri said. Necromancer Yongho, who put the devil's nails down, also intervened. Certainly, considering the recent battle he had, he felt it would be nice to have a necromancer, because there were enormous corpses everywhere each time he was done with a battle. Of course, it was quite inhumane from an ethical point of view. However, he could not deny that it was an attractive item. The synergy effect when combined with the power of evolution seemed to be enormous. As the proverb said, strike the iron while it's hot. Yongho looked around to see if there was a necromancer familiar for sale. Right at that moment, A surprisingly sweet scent tickled his nose. Not only Yong-ho, but Kaiwan and Catalina also turned their heads instinctively as if they also smelled the scent. The source of the smell was a sales item across from the elf spirit. There was a large pot and a small teacup there, Citri said, pointing to the purple drink in the teacup. It's soma. It is a soft drink with a slight hallucination effect. Since the scent is particularly good, it seems to be a really high-quality product, Kaiwan swallowed, while Catalina flapped her ears violently. It looked as if she wanted to drink both of them, but could not dare to ask her. At that moment, a woman wearing an ugly and terrifying red ghost mask elbowed her way through the clients and came to Yong-ho. The woman who checked the soma quickly wrote the bidding price. Because of her ghost mask, Yong-ho could see her face, but given her figure and charming air, she was obviously a great beauty. She was wearing a colorful red suit that suited the ghost mask, but unlike her long and loose sleeves, her lower body was almost naked. Her white legs tied with a thong underneath the short skirt that revealed her thighs clearly were attractive with beautiful curves. Yong-ho looked at the woman. It was not because he was attracted by her stunning beauty. His heart was pounding, and his breathing became rough before he knew it. Obviously, he felt it before. This time, the way his heart trembled was different from when he first ran into Catalina and Kaiwan. The man wearing a ghost mask, someone came to his mind suddenly. He was a giant man who met her eyes the other day when she visited the auction house. No, it's not that my heart is pounding. He didn't get it right back then, partly because he was at a distance from the other party, and it was partly because he felt it on impulse back then. But he could understand it clearly now, because he obtained the heart of the demon god. He could distinguish it because he had experienced his heart throbbing when he met his lover several times. It was greed. Greed was the source of his excitement. Then why was his heart throbbing? Because he wants to have her. Because of his sexual desire. Right at that moment, he got goosebumps, and the woman turned around as if on cue. They looked at each other, wearing their masks. The woman, who faced him, frowned as if something was strange, and he stopped being nervous with an effort. Instead of avoiding her eyes right away, he stared at her for a little while. Her rainbow-colored eyes were shining like stars. They had an air of dignity and intensity that overwhelmed him. He caught his breath. He just acted like someone who accidentally met her eyes. He smiled awkwardly inside the mask, then nodded at her lightly like an English gentleman in a movie he had seen one day. Then he turned around and walked on naturally. Citri hugged his arm. She egged on him to see the next auction items quickly. As if she read his intentions, Citri led him away from that woman. Catalina and Kaiwan also acted tactfully. As Yong-ho's familiar spirits, they did not make the mistake of looking back. While moving away from that woman, Catalina's tail became a little stiff, but Kaiwan managed it well. Catalina flinched when Kaiwan grabbed her tail tightly in a surprise, and thanks to her quick-witted action, it looked like they were playing pranks on each other like close friends. The distance between Yong-ho and the woman increased further. The auction crowds filled the place they left. Even after Yong-ho's party left and the auction was going on here and there, the woman was standing still in place, as if fixated on it. She stared at him for a while, then tilted her head only after he completely disappeared. Then she bit her lips out of frustration. What the hell is it? She didn't murmur it to herself. Actually, she was talking to a woman with a bear mask who caught up with her belatedly. With a strong build and lots of muscles, she was big enough to fit in the bear mask. She also looked at the direction the woman was gazing at. There was nothing special over there, so she tilted her head and asked, "What's the matter with you?" The woman did not answer right away, but just closed her lips once. Then, crossing her arms, she said, standing a bit stiffly, "It's definitely my first time seeing that man. But why was my heart throbbing as soon as I made eye contact with him? My breathing was also rough." At her serious question, this woman with a strong build blinked her eyes. Then she expressed her opinion mixed with embarrassment and expectations. "Because you fell in love with him at first sight?" "No way. How can I love him only by looking at his eyes on the mask? You must have checked out his figure, let alone his impression, right?" She puckered her lips again at this strong woman's response. Obviously, she liked his build quite a lot. She was also happy about his height. No, it can't be, and he was a weird guy. Even when he made eye contact with me, he wasn't agitated at all. Rather, he nodded at me in a composed manner. He must have smiled even inside the mask. Have you stared at him with your jewel-like piercing eyes? Asking the question, this strong woman got embarrassed. Then the other woman apologetically replied as if to make excuses. Well, I did before I knew it. I just looked at him. That's all. It looks like you were clearly attracted to him. There are few men who remained calm even after encountering my master. The woman's eyes were the eyes of a king. Because of this, anybody without extraordinary courage and boldness didn't dare to encounter her. Do you think so? Yes, you might have taken a liking to him, the strong woman asked with more interest this time. Chapter 180, King of the Unclaimed Land 6. No, it doesn't make any sense. The woman shook her head again, getting such a possibility out of her mind. It was because of her toying with the idea of loving a man, just didn't make any sense in reality. Of course, she felt several times that her heart pounded when she met other kings. But it was when she was in battle, and in a fierce battle with other kings at that. If her heart had not pounded in such a situation, she would have looked very weird. Her fury back then was roaring itself. It synced with other sins and roared against other sins. But it was different now. She felt something she couldn't explain. The only thing she could express at the moment was that she felt something intense the moment she encountered him. Oh my, did I really fall for him at first sight? At that moment, the woman blushed in embarrassment, and her attendant and faithful friend, Yacha woman, grinned inside her bear mask. She visited the auction house with her master suffering from ever-growing depression for a change, so her surprising response after meeting a masked man was an unexpected pleasure. If you see him again, you will find out if you are really hooked on him. If your heart is pounding again, I think you must love him. Right. The auction just started. So, she still had lots of time to hang around before the official auction began. She again looked at the direction where Yong-ho disappeared. This woman called Dhritarashtra, King of Fury, nodded slowly and tapped her chest once for no special reason. She must be the owner of the sin, Yong-ho was convinced. He couldn't even think of any other possibilities. One of the 6 kings visited the dungeon market auction house. If so, who was it? Which sin belonged to this woman who ran into Yong-ho? You're okay now? He suddenly regained his sense of reality upon hearing Citrus' words. He found himself already out of the crowded free auction house. He was in a secret room where he once stopped by when he had first visited the auction house. Catalina and Kaiwan first took off their masks, perhaps because they were freed from the embarrassment and tension beyond their understanding. Yong-ho also took off the male lion's mask and buried himself on the sofa. Citri said again, "Probably, she is the King of Fury." Catalina and Kaiwan were startled. On the other hand, Citri combed her hair casually after taking off her mask. She sat on the sofa across him and said, "As I said first, the only thing that you can cover with a mask is your face. There are many factors with which you can identify the other party." He just listened to her instead of expressing his opinion. Citri listed the reasons one by one and counted on her fingers. First of all, the gender of that masked person was a woman. Besides, her medium height, white skin and slim figure, dark blue hair, and a sweet flavor characteristic of Gandharva. Gandharva was a race with an overwhelming number of men, compared with women. There were not so many Gandharva women even in the vast demon world, who had the status high enough to access the auction house. The King of Fury revealed herself directly in numerous battlefields, and as a result, there were lots of things identified about her look. Everything Citri just mentioned coincided with the King of Fury's look. And the decisive evidence that she was the King of Fury was your hunch. He seemed very surprised to meet her. Citri then pointed to the silver bracelet. The bracelet that hid the power of Brigada also had the effect of sharing status information among its wearers. Yong-ho covered his face with both hands. Then he said in a much calmer voice, "Well, it wasn't just a resonance between sins. Although he didn't have any specific evidence of it, he was convinced of it. As she said, it could be called his hunch." Citri did not disagree with him. Rather, she nodded and said, "Because you have that woman's legacy, the heart of the demon god. The legacy Mammon, the king of greed, left behind in the human world." At that moment, Yong-ho raised his head suddenly and replied immediately, "Greed, fury, gluttony. They were the sins that Mammon possessed in the past." Yong-ho felt he could understand it now. It wasn't just something like resonance. The heart of the demon god that he had was a replica of the one owned by Mammon, the king of greed, in the past. However, that did not mean it had low quality. Since it was a perfect replica, it shared the memory of the original owner. The heart of the demon god did not forget the sin of fury. He missed the sin he had once cherished. It is less likely that the king of fury recognized me. Yong-ho made a conclusion like that before he knew it, although he himself had the heart of the demon god. The king of fury did not. She had never harbored any other sin than fury, probably, but she must have been strongly impressed by you. I mean, her heart must have throbbed when she saw you. Yong-ho also understood it. It wasn't just because of the fact that he made eye contact with the king of fury. He had a similar experience. A man in a ghost mask. He was farther away from that man than when he faced the king of fury. His power of greed was also much weaker than now. However, Yong-ho knew that his feelings then and now were fundamentally the same. His greed that united with the demon god's heart made him convinced of it. Then, who was the man in the ghost mask? Which sin did he have? What Citri said about it helped Yong-ho find out the clue. Besides the mask, there were many clues about the masked man. For example, the tips given by Embryo. Yong-ho already knew all the tips. He came up with an answer naturally. There was only one possibility of his identity. The king of gluttony. Yong-ho had an adversary in front of him now. He had already met the king. Then I will close the deal today. Samael laughed softly. The king of gluttony, who was facing her with a desk in between, nodded with a satisfied expression and said, "It was a good deal too this time. Thank you for visiting us, as always." She exchanged pleasantries with him. She had made several secret deals with the king of gluttony, but that was it. Their interaction could never be called a special relationship. His deal with Samael wasn't a perfect secret deal. The 5 directors of the dungeon market knew what and how Samael traded with the king of gluttony. Samael simply played the role of a terminal. This transaction was between the dungeon market and the king of gluttony, not between Samael as an individual and the king of gluttony. Other kings also made secret deals with the dungeon market, and any information about their transaction was also shared by other directors during their meeting. The auction house is still booming. "It seems that many people participated this time," said the king of gluttony. His words were only perfunctory, but given their unusual position in the demon world, their conversation carried some significance. Samael replied with an angelic expression, "Because the war in the north is not the end of the world." Depending on who interpreted her words, it had various implications. The king of gluttony laughed heartily and said, "I'll see you at the main auction. See you then." The king of gluttony wore the ghost mask and stood up. Samael got up from her seat and saw him off in person. Both of them didn't say any further after parting there. They didn't reveal their innermost thoughts to each other. When the door of the secret room was closed, Samael let her back wings droop. Her face-to-face dealing with the king of gluttony always exhausted her. As if to show off the fact that he was a king, he showed his desire without hesitation. Does he want to be the king of the unclaimed land? Is it what he hides in his fiery desires? It was hidden in the king of gluttony's craving for her, namely his incredible gluttony. Normally, she would not have noticed it because she was blinded by other intense desires, but today she knew it. Samael was sincere, like Citri said. She did a lot of research on the Mammon family, and she discovered that rumors in the south, to be precise, about the fight between the Mammon family and Embryo, the king of wolves, were artificially twisted. The unclaimed land in the south was the realm of Citri, the highest among the 5 directors. So, Samael didn't think about it deliberately. But now the situation had changed. The unclaimed land was virtually unified. Moreover, the method of unification was very violent. It was not a one-sided unification. The warlords who rose up the army in various places attacked each other as if they were playing a tournament. As a result, the deserted southern land became more desolate. But on the contrary, there were some things that became stronger. The Demon King was supposed to grow big when he took the essence of someone equal to or stronger than himself. It was not efficient for him to take the essence of someone weaker than himself. The tournament-style fight that took place in various places brought about the effective concentration of essence. If someone had unified the South unilaterally, he would have preserved the dungeons and their masters, but he would not have achieved the concentration of such a huge power like now. the king of the unclaimed land. Why did the king of gluttony covet him? Did he simply wanted the essence of the unclaimed land? Or was there anything else that Samael herself didn't know yet? What if things happened as Samael speculated? Samael stopped thinking. Trimming her tired wings, she left the secret room. It was time for her to face the king of the unclaimed land. The king of fury stepped forward, looking around. Maybe because of the Yacha woman chattering beside her, she felt her heart beginning to pound again, even when she could not find the man with a lion mask. He walked leisurely. However, contrary to his slow movement, his sin of gluttony was in full active mode. He constantly expressed hunger. The main auction time was approaching. Kings and other influential figures began to gather in one place. Another king started to move among them.